Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. So I think a lot of us probably followed in the news this case between Dominion and Fox in the States. And it settled last week. I was a little bit disappointed it settled because I really wanted to see the case go to court and hear the arguments and hear the testimony by some of the Fox executives. But it settled for an astonishing $787 million. And so I really wanted to check in with a lawyer that I think very highly of. I've had the opportunity to interview him a few times before. Douglas Elliott is his name. He's a lawyer with Cambridge LLP. He lives in Elliott Lake, which I presume is named after you and your last name. There's probably a story there.
Yeah.
But Douglas is number one, a very smart guy. Number two, a lawyer. And number three, has followed this case, he says, very closely. So Douglas, tell me, what did you think about this $787 million settlement?
I thought it was mind-blowing. I never expected that Rupert Murdoch would ever part with that much money voluntarily. I really did not believe that was going to happen. I take my hat off to the lawyers to achieve that settlement. Prior to that, the largest settlement that we know about, a lot of these settlements are confidential, Brian. So I think that's why a lot of people hedge their statements about whether this was the large, but it's the largest known defamation settlement in the United States. Previous one was only $177 million. So it is colossal. And I know a lot of people feel that they should have gone to trial and so on, but I think it was excellent lawyering on the part of Justin Nelson and his team. And even for somebody like Rupert Murdoch, nearly $800 million, that hurts.
Big time. And astounding, because I think Dominion's valuation was like something like $78 million. So they got a settlement that was like 10 times the value of the whole company.
Yes, and in fact, that was one of the main lines of attack that Fox News was using, which I thought was actually their best argument, which was, I thought it was obvious, and based on we can talk about the pretrial rulings in a minute, but I thought they had very little to defend themselves with. And the main defense they had that would work is to say that the amount of money that Dominion was asking for was outrageous given the size of the company, that given the amount of their sales, that, maybe 10, 20, $50 million would be plenty. But it's pretty clear that the plaintiff's lawyers were looking for a very large number, close to $1 billion, and they were not going to settle for anything less than that kind of large number. And to my great surprise, Fox News folded. There's lots of reasons for that, I'm sure, and we can talk about that, but it was a big surprise they would part with that much cash.
Why did you follow this case with such interest?
Well, I've been very concerned about the toxic environment in the social media and mainstream media ever since Trump has come to power. He has appropriated actually a Nazi term, the Lügenpresse, the Nazis called it. He called it fake news, telling people that you can't trust journalists. You can only trust the real good journalists. And there's been this polarization in the American media. And, you can characterize it as the Fox and CNN camps. And when you go into those media environments, it's like entering an alternate universe, and particularly at Fox, that over the years, they've shed reliable journalists like Chris Wallace and Shepard Smith. And people that they have been promoting are people like Tucker Carlson, who's just a propagandist for the far right, who's totally unhinged from the truth and reality. But he seemed to be able to get away with saying anything on the air. And I couldn't understand why no one was suing these guys for defamation, because it was over the top. It was beyond what is free speech as I understand it in the United States. So I was so glad to see that these people were finally being held to account. I know Alex Jones got sued, but he's, way out on the fringe. Fox News is the biggest news network, so-called, in the United States. It's a huge, more or less mainstream organization, and Tucker Carlson is their most popular figure.
But I think the interesting thing is what at least a lot of the disclosed testimony or emails, not testimony, but emails and text messages and other things divulge, is that Tucker Carlson doesn't actually believe what he says. That he actually isn't as unhinged as you just said. He in private, he actually admits that some of the statements are absurd and crazy.
Yes, and I think a lot of people who have followed people like Tucker Carlson have been wondering for some years, is this the real Tucker Carlson, or is this some kind of performance like Dame Edna Everage, that it's a persona that Tucker Carlson is presenting, and propaganda that he's presenting. What emerged from the lawyers did a great job with their what's called discovery, the pretrial investigation. They dug really deep. They got into Tucker Carlson's emails and texts, and the same with Rupert Murdoch. Everybody had to put their cards on the table. And people often in emails and texts are a lot more candid than they are on the air. And so we found out that Tucker Carlson thought that Trump was a terrible person, and that all of these things that were being said by Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell were nonsense. And yet he kept putting it on the air. Not only did they keep putting it on the air, but and part of their defense was, we were just reporting what somebody like Sidney Powell was saying, or something that Rudy Giuliani was asserting, and that's news. But the judge, in a recent ruling, Judge Eric Davis, who is one of my heroes now, he said, when you look at all those texts and emails and what Fox was putting on the air, it's very clear that they knew there was lots of evidence that contradicted these allegations of fraud, and they never put any of that on the air. They presented these allegations as if they were truth. And the reason they did it, to make money, because they were concerned that if they didn't tell the Fox viewers what they wanted to hear, that they were going to tune out and they were going to go over to Newsmax and the other conservative competitors of Fox News. So it was a very crass commercial decision to lie to the Fox audience, and they didn't care one bit about the impact on Dominion. And the impact on Dominion and its employees was terrible. They had death threats against their employees.
Now, my understanding is that to actually have won at trial, they had to prove malice. They had to prove a high level of intent. Explain to us all, if you could, why that's such a high level to actually prove.
Well, this goes back to a very famous, this is probably the most important case since that ruling in the case of New York Times and Sullivan, which is the one that the Fox News was relying on. In that case, the New York Times published some statements about a Southern sheriff that were erroneous. And the sheriff argued that because they were erroneous, they were defamatory, and therefore he was entitled to damages. But the Supreme Court in that case said, no, journalists are entitled to make mistakes, and it's not defamatory because there's a public interest in allowing them to discuss important public issues. And if they get it wrong occasionally, that's not defamatory. In order to prove defamation against a journalist in the United States, you have to prove actual malice. And that means either you knew that it was untrue and published it, or you didn't actually care. You were reckless. You didn't bother investigating to find out whether it was true or not, and you went ahead and published it. Well, that's almost impossible to prove, almost impossible. But in this case, they had Fox dead to rights. It was obvious that Fox knew, many people, even Rupert Murdoch himself, knew that the things that were being said about Dominion were 100% BS, And there was plenty of evidence to demonstrate that. They just disregarded that evidence and put the allegations against Dominion on the air as if they were the truth. And it was all to support Donald Trump and his allegations that the election was rigged, and to pander to their audience so that they would make money. And the best way of punishing someone who does something improper in pursuit of profit is to take those profits away from them.
And the judge effectively said it was untrue, and I think, didn't he rule that they weren't actually allowed to raise at trial that it might be true?
Indeed, he did. I think this is the main reason, Brian, that the case settled, is because before the trial, the clever lawyers for Dominion brought a motion, what we call a motion for summary judgment, saying there are certain matters that are so obvious they shouldn't even be put to the jury. The judge should get rid of them ahead of time. And Judge Eric Davis did this, and he said that it was crystal clear, and he put crystal in caps, bold, and italics. I've never seen any judge do that anywhere ever. Crystal clear that none of the allegations that were made against Dominion were true. And he said he was not going to allow Fox to argue. He was not going to allow Fox to argue that any of the allegations were true. And he was not going to allow Fox to argue that they were just offering neutral reportage of false allegations, because he said that there was they had extensive evidence that the fraud claims were untrue, and the fact that they never reported any of them revealed that their reporting, as he put it, was not disinterested. That was an understatement, to be sure, but he deprived them of that. So what they were left with was going in there, having a finding that all of this was false, and that they refused to report any of the contradictory evidence because they were not being objective. And based on that, they were going to have to try and prove that there was no malice based on the New York Times and Sullivan test. I think that would have been impossible for them to win that point in front of the jury. So the only thing that was going to be left to them was, what was it worth? What was it worth? And I think that, Rupert Murdoch would have had to get in the witness box. Tucker Carlson would have had to get in the witness box. And the lawyers for the plaintiffs would have made mincemeat out of them. There would have been blood on the floor. It would have been terribly embarrassing for them. And who knows what an American jury might do? In the Alex Jones case, they got a jury awarded over $1 billion. They might have gotten more than $1 billion. They might have gotten significantly more than $1 billion. I mean, they certainly wouldn't. No jury in the States in Delaware would have been worried about Rupert Murdoch going hungry if you awarded a $2 billion award against him. He certainly could afford it and wouldn't go bankrupt. So I would think the sky could be the limit. That's what I would have, if I was advising Rupert Murdoch, that's what I would have told him. Well, I would have said, I'd be very nervous about this jury.
And then I guess the logical question then is, why did Dominion settle? But anyway, we're going to take a break for some messages and come back in 2 minutes. I'm going to ask Douglas why he think they, in the end, settled, if it was so possible that they could get over $1 billion, if not over $2 billion. Stay with us, everyone. This is going to be an interesting conversation with an incredibly smart, experienced lawyer talking about the Fox Dominion issue and the $787 million settlement, US dollars even, last week. Stay with us, everyone. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Wire on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight about this Dominion case against Fox News that settled last week for $787 million US dollars. And Douglas Elliott with it's Cambridge LLP, is that correct?
That's it.
A very experienced civil litigator and lawyer, has tried constitutional cases, has done many settlements, has done lots of different interesting legal cases, and I think we could chat about that potentially in the future. But just before the break, Douglas, you were saying that you thought that a jury in Delaware may have actually been able to award $1 billion or over $2 billion, and that you felt that the evidence was so strong that there was almost no question they would win. Well, if there's almost no question that they would win and that the award could have been that high, why did Dominion settle? They could have made twice as much money as they actually got in the settlement.
That's a very good question. And I know you said at the outset that you were a little disappointed that it didn't go to trial. And I think that's true for a lot of people who were cheering Dominion on felt the same way. They felt a little disappointed that they settled. And in fact, today in the New York Times and the Globe and Mail, John Poulos, who founded Dominion in Toronto, it's a Canadian company originally, that's why it's called Dominion, many years ago, he explained some of his thinking about the settlement. So we have some insight. One of the things he's been criticized for is the fact that he didn't insist on an apology from Fox. And I've been involved in many cases where an apology featured in the settlement. That included the LGBT purge class action that I got approved in 2018 for $145 million. Not 800 million, but still not bad. In that case, we were able to get apologies. The difference is that in that case, it was pretty clear that the Trudeau government was sincere about apologizing for the historic injustice of the LGBT purge. John Poulos says that he drafted an apology, and then talking to his colleagues, he realized that a forced apology from Fox was really not going to be meaningful. And so he scrapped the idea. What Fox ended up doing was simply acknowledging the judge's ruling that they had reported false statements. But they went on to issue this ridiculous statement saying they were motivated by their commitment to the highest journalistic standards, which I think most of us laughed out loud when we heard that. I think the reason that Dominion settled, partly it was because they realized they were only going to get money. They weren't going to get the apology or any of the acts of contrition that I think a lot of people were hoping for. They were already happy that a lot of the evidence, Poulos talks about this, and I think he's right, that a lot of the evidence that Fox knew that this was all lies was already in the public domain. So the public knew about it. They didn't need a trial to have learned about that. And the amount was not confidential. Most settlements are confidential. So the fact that it was public would be humiliating to Fox. And, Justin Nelson, the lead lawyer, said lies have consequences. And I think most people would agree nearly $800 million. Those are some pretty serious consequences. And let's not forget, this isn't the end of the lawsuits. Dominion has lawsuits against Rudy Giuliani, against Sidney Powell, against Mike Lindell and Patrick Byrne. And those people, $800 million, any one of them, like I think Patrick Byrne and Mike Lindell, they might be worth $100 million each. Well, this would clean them out. This will be the end. And Fox itself is facing a further lawsuit from a company called Smartmatic, where they're being sued for similar allegations, and they're suing them for $2.7 billion. So this is not the end of the suffering for Fox, in my view. And more importantly, I think the fact that they took down the Goliath, they took down Fox News, they now have an $800 million war chest with which to pursue Newsmax and Mike Lindell and the other people that they're suing for making the same statements. Given the judge's findings and that vast war chest, those people would be very sensible to run up the white flag. Otherwise, they're going to end up bankrupt by their foul conduct in spreading these lies about Dominion.
So let's turn the issue for a second. Why did Fox settle? I heard one commentator say Fox wasn't worried about the money. They were worried about how unbelievably damaging and embarrassing having Tucker Carlson, Rupert Murdoch, et cetera, on the stand would be. What's your assessment?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's two reasons that they settled. So one, let's be clear, they didn't settle the case because they said in their statements the two things they were concerned about was the expense of a trial. And that's nonsense, because the expense of a trial is nothing. It could be $10 million or $20 million, but it's small potatoes compared to 800 million. So that's just misleading. That wasn't a consideration. They also said their commitment to integrity was part of it. I don't believe that for a minute. I don't believe that there are cases like the LGBT purge where the defendant really feels badly about what happened, or residential schools, like the Pope apologized. Sometimes when people said, oh, they really feel bad about what happened. I don't think Fox feels bad about what happened. I think they just feel bad that they got caught. And so they made the decision, I think, for two reasons. First, because they were worried that they were going to have to pay a lot more. Alex Jones was forced to pay $1 billion. I think the plaintiff's lawyers were going to point to that and tell the jury that if Alex Jones had to pay $1 billion, then Rupert Murdoch should pay a lot more. And the second reason, I think, is because the judge had ruled that Rupert Murdoch himself had to get in the box, that he was not immune, and he had just issued a ruling saying that the Fox lawyers had withheld evidence of Rupert Murdoch's, and he was going to sanction them. So not only were they going to be embarrassed in front of the jury about the lies they had told, but they were going to be exposed as having tried to hide the truth from the jury itself. And I'm not talking about some lowlife at Fox News. I'm talking about the big boss, Rupert Murdoch. And if Rupert Murdoch was found to have concealed evidence in an effort to avoid getting whacked by the jury, American juries do not hesitate to punish that conduct with big punitive damage awards. And that would have been both terribly embarrassing for Rupert Murdoch and financially painful. But no billionaire like Rupert Murdoch likes the idea of being under the control of some Delaware judge and the plaintiff's counsel and have to answer a bunch of questions. It's humiliating, it's demeaning, but he's just a human being. And if you operate a business in the United States, then you have to be willing to be a witness in an American court of law. Everybody's equal under the law, and them's the breaks, Rupert.
Douglas, I said I was disappointed it didn't go to trial. And one of the reasons why is I really think there's a public policy issue here, that, honesty is important, that putting forward facts is important, that journalism shouldn't be just entertainment. Like, I can understand that, you've got columnists and things like that don't actually have to report facts, can report opinions. But when you're masquerading as a journalist and as a news channel, you should present facts. If it is an opinion, you should say it's an opinion. And we've missed out on that public policy benefit, have we not?
Perhaps not. I think that, we would have got more benefit from a trial in that regard. But I think the fact that that Fox News was exposed as, not only did they not do the fact checking, which I think we both know is standard fare for any sensible journalist, any journalist I've known. I mean, I was interviewed by a teenager with CBC a couple of weeks ago, and he's coming back fact checking with me. So, even a kid knows enough to do fact checking, but Fox News doesn't care. Their business model has been thoroughly exposed by the pretrial stuff. And I think that the fact that the judge ruled that they're not allowed to report lies and treat it as news because the lies themselves are news and escape responsibility, I think that has advanced the law. I also think that the fact that they had to pay out a landmark settlement for their lies is going to help. And more importantly now, in some ways, they've got $800 million to pursue the people who were the source of these lies in the first place. Don't forget, Fox News didn't create these lies. They just reported them, and they reported them in order to build their audience. The people who were actually spouting these lies were lawyers like Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell, and millionaires like Mike Lindell and Patrick Byrne. or soon to be former millionaires, I will say, because I think they're going to be wiped out by this. I think that with that $800 million war chest, I think that Dominion is going to go on to pursue this, and I commend them. We're lucky that Dominion had financial backers who were willing to pursue this, because this was a David and Goliath struggle. Sure, it's not that Dominion was impoverished, but this was a case of millionaires going after one of the richest men in the world, Rupert Murdoch. He could afford to pay lawyers and tie them up in court for 1,000 years. He was extremely wealthy and powerful, and they took him down for almost $1 billion. And they gave themselves a war chest to pursue the other liars to the ends of the earth. I think it's a fantastic result. I commend them. I don't think I could have done better, that's for sure. And having negotiated some large settlements, it's tough. It's tough to get a big settlement like this, because one of the major motivations usually for a defendant to settle is the fact that they don't want to pay their lawyers to defend the case. And once a case gets up to $100 million or more, then the defense costs become irrelevant, because it's going to be cheaper for them to give that money to their lawyers to fight you than it is to write a check. And so it's hard to settle a case of this size. It's a great result.
I gotta say though, did anyone ever believe Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell? Like, when I remember some of those news conferences where Rudy Giuliani was, the hair dye was streaming down his cheek from what was that? It was like unbelievable named flower shop. I couldn't. Was it the
Right.
Four Seasons flower shop?
It was it was like he thought it was going to be the Four Seasons Hotel, and I think it was like the Four Seasons landscaping company that was next to a crematorium. It was laughable. The whole thing was ridiculous.
It was so laughable that it was funnier than the Saturday Night Live skits about it. Like, it was just, did anyone actually believe Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell?
Yes, they did. I mean, the judge made this comment in his ruling. He said, there's still lots of people who believe that the election was stolen from Donald Trump. And he said, it's impossible to draw a direct line from Fox News's reporting to that widely held belief by Americans. But there's no doubt, when you look at the history of this, that the reason that Fox peddled these lies is because when their political observers called the election for Joe Biden, their viewers had a fit and said, this is Donald Trump won. You can't say that Joe Biden won. And they started backpedaling furiously, trying to find a way to pander to the Trump supporters and to make them feel good about the fact that Trump didn't actually lose, that the election was stolen in some way. And frankly, the whole Dominion conspiracy stuff, that was a kind of pseudo-scientific, pseudo-legal way of saying, oh, that's how it happened, because there was no other evidence. And Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell kept saying, oh, we have this evidence, we have these sources. Well, one of the things that came out through this lawsuit, apparently this whole Dominion thing started with some woman who sent an email to Sidney Powell, but she also in her email talks about how the wind was speaking to her, and she would clearly, from what she wrote, the poor woman was obviously mentally ill, and this belief about Dominion was a product of psychotic delusions. But this was the so-called evidence that Sidney Powell was latching onto, that Dominion was behind this conspiracy. So when you dig down, Fox News was reporting the psychotic ravings of some mentally ill woman as if it was truth. That's what they were doing at the end. And they were dressing it up, wrapping it up in a glossy news program with a famous lawyer like Rudy Giuliani. And you and I didn't believe it, maybe, Brian, but there's millions of Americans who did. And it was very corrosive to American democracy. You know, now a recent poll showed that 25% of Americans believe that a strong leader is more important than democracy. That's a very scary number. And that, I believe, is a direct result of people like Tucker Carlson and the reporting of Fox News that led people to believe in the lies that Donald Trump was peddling, that there was some plot and some way in which Joe Biden had stolen the election from him.
More people believe a strong leader is important than democracy.
Yeah, 25% of Americans, which lines up roughly exactly with Donald Trump's loyal supporters in the Republican Party.
Well, that's the scariest thing that you've said all morning. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in 2 minutes with Douglas Elliott, a lawyer and a really smart guy. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Douglas Elliott. He's a lawyer, a civil litigator with Cambridge LLP, and a very knowledgeable gentleman in regards to this case in the United States between Dominion and Fox News that settled last week for $787 million. Douglas, a couple of points I want to go through if I could. You mentioned Alex somebody rather a few times and the $1 billion settlement. A lot of people may not be familiar with that case. Can you just give us a little paragraph on that, please, sir?
Yeah, sure. Alex Jones is a well-known far-right political figure, early supporter of Donald Trump, and he runs a webcast called InfoWars, where he peddles all kinds of conspiracy theories and has done for years. He uses it to sell vitamins and supplements, and that's how he really makes his money. But he's had all kinds of far-right figures, including Donald Trump, on his show. One of the conspiracy theories that he peddled for many years was that the Sandy Hook massacre didn't actually happen, that it was fake, that it was staged by the parents, that there was no such mass killing. And the result of he has a very loyal following of extremists. And those people ended up harassing those parents, threatening them with death, causing them all kinds of grief for a very long time. Eventually, after about 7 or 8 years, Alex Jones finally admitted that there was actually no proof of any of the things that he had said. But by that time, he was being sued. He didn't accept any responsibility for any of the things that had happened as a consequence of his lies. And he was sued for defamation by the parents, and they got a judgment against him and his company for $1 billion. And he's tried to, they're still fighting it because he's trying to find ways of hiding his assets and moving them around to try and avoid actually having to pay, which is different from the Fox News case, because John Poulos, the president of Dominion, has made it clear that before they settled the case, Fox News actually wired $787.5 million to Dominion's bank account.
Oh my God.
So they didn't wait to try and collect. They wanted the money in their hand before they dropped the case. The parents, unfortunately, who are pursuing Alex Jones, they're going to be spending a number of years trying to collect on that judgment. And in the meantime, Alex Jones is still on the air.
Well, I guess another reason why a settlement is more beneficial than the judgment is that you get the cash in your bank account.
You got it.
You had mentioned the other case. I think the company's Smartmatic. Is that?
That's right.
I saw.
So Smartmatic. Yeah, go ahead.
I saw an interview with Rudy Giuliani about that, and he was saying that Smartmatic was founded by Chavez from Venezuela. Like, again, the allegations were so absurd, it sounded like an SNL skit.
It's true. It was totally absurd. And in fact, they said that they said that Smartmatic was controlled by Hugo Chavez, and that Smartmatic in turn controlled Dominion, and Dominion then flipped all of these votes from Trump to Biden. It was a very complicated, bizarre, and totally false conspiracy theory that was peddled about Smartmatic. And Smartmatic is pursuing Fox News for $2.7 billion. You can bet that the lawyers for Smartmatic are not going to settle for a penny less than what Dominion got, and they may actually insist on getting more. So this settlement, and Fox News knew that when they agreed to pay Dominion. So they have set the bar at $787.5 million. I'm going to go out on a limb here and predict that they're going to have to pay at least that much and possibly more in order to settle the Smartmatic case, because again, it's obvious that the things that were said about Smartmatic are untrue. They don't own Dominion, for example, and we already know there's a ruling that everything that was said about Dominion was lies by Fox News. So Fox News has very little room to maneuver. Again, I think their only defense to the Smartmatic case is going to be to say, well, it didn't hurt you that much. You're not entitled to hundreds of millions of dollars. You're only entitled to millions of dollars. But that's going to be a pretty tough argument to make in light of the Alex Jones case and in light of the settlement with Dominion. I think they're going to have to write a very, very large check to Smartmatic to make that case go away. And if they don't, you and I will have the pleasure of watching the trial and watching Tucker Carlson and Rupert Murdoch get cross-examined. I will be tuning into that if it happens, for sure.
You had said a couple of times that you were very impressed with the lawyering here, and maybe I could ask you to take a step back and sort of be law professor for a second and tell me, why are you so impressed? You mentioned pretrial motions, the motion for summary judgment, but I think the most damaging things were the disclosure of some of the discovery. And I thought most of the things that one finds in discovery are supposed to be, confidential until you go to trial. So tell me why you think they were such smart lawyers.
Well, I think they were such smart lawyers. When you talk about the discovery stuff, I think that's absolutely true. I think that let's start with the fact that they were very tenacious about getting the scope of the case very wide. So they got the Fox parent company, they got Rupert Murdoch, they got Tucker Carlson, they got all the big targets caught in the net of the lawsuit. So that meant any questions or documents connected with those entities were fair game for the discovery process. And they were tenacious about getting every text, every email, everything from these people. Once they got it, it was obvious that it was very damaging. And then they found a way to put it in the public domain. You're quite right. These things are normally considered confidential, and they don't come out until trial, and then only if they're relevant in the context of what's going on in trial. However, because Fox was stupid enough to stick to this position that what was being said was true, and that even if it wasn't true, they were reporting it in good faith, that gave the lawyers for Dominion the opportunity to bring what's called a motion for summary judgment to determine issues before trial. And when you determine issues before trial, you have to file affidavit evidence and other evidence in support of your motion, which then goes into the public domain. And that included the Tucker Carlson text messages saying that Sidney Powell was a lunatic, everything, and the stuff from Rupert Murdoch saying this stuff is insane. All of that went into the record on their motion for summary judgment. And because it was filed with the court, it could be reported by you, the New York Times, everyone else could report on it because it was now in the public domain. So that was a masterstroke That's something you couldn't recover from. But what made it better was that the judge actually found in favor of Dominion. If he had ruled against Dominion on that motion for summary judgment, it may be that Fox would have had an opportunity to explain away those text messages and those emails as, not in the proper context, and we're going to explain it at trial and all of that sort of thing. But the judge's ruling made it so painfully obvious that Fox was wrong and that those damaging emails and texts meant exactly what they said. They were going in not just with one arm tied behind their back in that trial, but with both arms tied behind their back. And that rarely happens, I got to tell you. That kind of searching discovery is very expensive. And every motion that they brought before, the summary judgment motion, the discovery motions, every motion that those lawyers brought before trial, they won. And in fact, the most telling moment for me was when Rupert Murdoch fired his lawyers. He changed lawyers after they lost a bunch of these pretrial motions. And he was hoping, I think, that with a new team of lawyers, that he was going to have more success on these pretrial motions. And things just went from bad to worse for him. So it was not about having bad lawyers representing Fox. They can afford the best lawyers in the country. It was about great lawyers representing Dominion and about Fox being terribly, terribly wrong and therefore deserving of losing.
So not dealing with the right or wrong, but just the lawyering aspect. The lessons are: number one, hire great lawyers, I guess. Number two is tenacity in the discovery process, and number three is the benefit of this motion for summary judgment.
Yeah, the motion for summary judgment is a very powerful tool. We have the same thing in Canada. And actually, a few years ago in Canada, in a case called Riniak and Malden, the Supreme Court of Canada said that Canadian judges should use this tool more often because trials are really expensive and uncertain. And so when a case is pretty clear cut, the judge shouldn't hesitate to dispose of it before trial. Interestingly,
is that I apologize for interrupting, but is that a judge's right and responsibility, or does one of the two parties have to actually bring a motion to allow the judge?
One of the two parties, no, the judge can't do anything on their own. And one of the two parties has to bring the motion. And the reality is, interestingly, often it's the defendant that brings the motion, who says, oh, the plaintiff has no case, they're out of time, their evidence is no good, their legal theory is bizarre. It's the defendant who brings this motion to try and intimidate and put pressure on the plaintiff. It's not that frequent that plaintiffs bring the motion saying the defense is bogus. But this, to me, shows that plaintiffs' lawyers should use this tool, the summary judgment tool, against defendants who have bogus defenses and who are just trying to outspend you in hopes that you'll quit before you get to the courtroom. The fact that they brought this summary judgment motion and won it in such convincing terms, that's, I think, was one of the main reasons that Fox settled. That plus the fact that that ruling that said that Rupert Murdoch had or the lawyers had withheld evidence, that was going to be, the judge was really angry about that. It was obvious, and he was going to punish them. And Rupert Murdoch is not a man who's used to being punished.
You mentioned that in the summary judgment, the judge had said crystal clear and did it in bold and italics. I'd heard a comment that actually was a negative because then one could appeal it because it suggested that he was biased in some manner.
Yes, there's always a danger in a case, like there's no doubt that the plaintiffs did very well with Judge Eric Davis, who was the judge who was taking this case toward trial. They got some really great rulings from him. And I always say in a legal situation, there's such a thing as winning too big. If the judge is so enthusiastic about your case and rules in your favor, that runs the risk that if there's an appeal, that you're going to be unable to establish that the judge was neutral and even-handed, and that it looks like he's biased in your favor. So that was a risk for the Dominion lawyers, for sure, that they were doing too well in front of Judge Davis, and that they were going to get he was going to get overturned on appeal. However, having said that, I think there was ample evidence to support Judge Davis's findings. So even if his language was criticized, you putting it in caps and bold, even if that got criticized by an appellate court, I don't think his findings were going to get overturned. And once a jury makes a decision in a case in the United States, as in Canada, appellate courts do not interfere with jury decisions unless they are what they call perverse. If they awarded $1 trillion against Fox News, then you might be able to get it overturned saying that it was perverse. But generally speaking, once the jury decides, you're done and you cannot get it overturned. So with those findings, I don't think those findings were likely to be overturned on appeal. That's what I would have told Rupert Murdoch. And with those constraints going into the trial, the defense lawyers for Fox didn't have much to work with in terms of a defense. I've been on, I usually do plaintiff's works, but I've done defendant's work too. And I can tell you that I wouldn't want to be Dan Webb, who was the lead lawyer for Fox News. He really just all he had left was to focus on the fact that Dominion was a small company and it was asking for a ridiculous amount of money compared to how much it was worth. I'm not sure that would have sat well with the jury, considering the terrible things that were said about them. And more importantly, they were going to hear testimony from the Dominion employees about how they had faced death threats and harassment, had to move and hide from their neighbors because they were thought to be in league with Hugo Chavez, trying to prevent Donald Trump from his rightful place in the White House. And it was a horrible, horrible experience for the Dominion employees. And of course, Rupert Murdoch had no harmful consequences as a result of these lies, nor did Tucker Carlson.
Yeah, they get more media, more attention. We're going to take a break. Fascinating conversation. We'll be back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody.
How's your son?
Welcome back, everyone. We're having an unbelievably interesting conversation with Douglas Elliott, a lawyer at Cambridge LLP, a civil litigator, about Dominion versus Fox, $78.5 million US. Douglas, you had said
787.5.
787.
787.
Douglas, you had made a comment that fake news is a Nazi term. Tell me what that comment was.
Yes. So if you go back and you look at it, I mean, Donald Trump was the one who started popularizing this term, fake news. And as soon as he started using it, I'd studied history in my undergrad. I'm a bit of a history nerd. And I went back, and of course, it was actually when Hitler was running for power with the Nazis back in the early 30s, he used an expression in German called the Lügenpresse, the lying press. And because the mainstream press in Germany was really hostile towards his party, and he told his followers not to trust the lying press and instead to read Nazi publications like the Völkischer Beobachter. And to me, Fox News is just the modern incarnation of the Völkischer Beobachter. It's a propaganda arm of the MAGA Republicans, and it publishes propaganda. It doesn't really care about the truth. It's not a real journal. And this is the ironic, is that the Lügenpresse, the fake news, of course, in Hitler's time, the fake news was really Hitler's publications. It wasn't the mainstream press in Germany. And now we see exposed here that the fake news was coming from Donald Trump's friends at Fox News, not from the New York Times or CNN, but from Fox News. They were the lying press.
Do you think $787.5 million and potentially something with Smartmatic or whatever will actually change anything at Fox News?
It will change things a little at Fox News. I don't think that, for one thing, they're going to be very careful about what they put in their texts and emails. You can be darn sure about that. But I think now Rupert Murdoch is going to insist that they at least create a paper trail to show that they have tried to fact check and that they have tried to at least cover themselves by making the usual, well, this is just an allegation, or there's evidence being put forward by others that says that this is not true. Do I think that Fox News is suddenly going to become balanced? Absolutely not. I think their journalistic standards are still going to be virtually non-existent, but they're going to be a little more careful because nobody wants to hand out $1 billion regularly, not even Rupert Murdoch.
Douglas, we could go on for another hour. The most important question that I wanted to ask you now, given everything you said, is that why doesn't someone go after Donald Trump? Because if it's crystal clear that all these facts were not facts, it would seem to me that whether it's defamation or something, someone should be able to go after Donald Trump for all the inaccuracies. But we're out of time, so I can't ask you that question. We're going to have to do it another time. Thank you, sir, for joining us. Really interesting conversation. I remind everyone I'm on Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca, even from Elliott, and you can get interesting conversations like this. Thanks for joining us.